Hello, and welcome to a presentation on how sexuality develops in childhood and how vulnerable this development is when adverse influences occur, such as scolding. By the way, my name is Frida Nødebo Nyrup, and I'm a trained psychologist and have taught and worked on this topic for many years. Unfortunately, we often have cultural norms that dictate that children should not be curious about their bodies and sexual sensations. As it is a very taboo area, there is a tendency for cultural norms in this area to be simply uncritically transferred from one generation to the next, without being corrected for unfortunate cultural elements. This means that especially girls are at a risk of developing reduced sexual desire and ability to, for example, have an orgasm, while boys are more at risk of developing unfortunate arousal patterns, just as it may risk affecting the social sexual competencies in a negative direction, with violations and assaults as a possible result. Hope that you will enjoy my presentation. So welcome to my presentation about children's sexual development. I'll say a little about the possible consequences if a child is not met with acceptance of the sexuality, and I also hope that I'm able to explain how the child's sensory-based sexuality develops and becomes what we know as adult sexuality, with both physical and mental components. It's an important theme for everyone who is in touch with children. I worked in a prison for 10 years, and I met several inmates who couldn't handle their sexuality in one way or another. And I heard their stories about childhood experiences. Here I got the idea that it matters how we act in relation to children's sexual curiosity. At this time, parents in Denmark were generally not very restrictive. But in recent decades, the majority of people in Denmark have moved to the left side of this illustration. Later on, I became an associate professor, and here the students reported more and more examples of children being distracted, prevented, or scolded when they tried to find space for play with sexual content. For example, as here, it was two nursing students who made an observation in a daycare center, and they told in their report that the educator stopped the swing and scolded a boy because he laughed and said it tickled his penis. As such reports and stories grew in number, I wanted to gain more knowledge and had some help to design two studies, as described here, which were carried out with the help from the students. The first study, each student in an entire year group had to examine and call a random nursery in Denmark. We had several results, most of all that 88% of the institutions we were in contact with in one way or another had a practice of distraction or prohibition. Some institutions were quite firm and told, "Our policy is very strict. The children are bluntly told that they mustn't, and the parents will be contacted." But does it matter discrediting children's sexuality? To find out, we had the second study. With the second study, we had no statistically significant correlation between the way we encountered children's play with sexual content and their sexuality as adults, but we had some other results. Data pointed in the direction of development of depression and lack of social sexual skills. It also said that women in particular seemed to be affected. Most of all, we had this result. Data pointed in the direction that a lack of recognition of childhood sexuality might have consequences in the form of sexual problems later in life. Yes, what does it mean when children are interrupted, scolded, or even punished? One male student gave a good picture of what he thought it had done to him that his parents had interrupted and scolded him when they found him trying masturbating. He described that he since that felt tormented by unpleasant feelings if he tried to masturbate, and that he today had problems with sexual intercourse. I was really surprised at how far-reaching he described his sexual problems. He described that he withdrew from social life as he felt it too difficult to participate in what he named boy talk, as the subject often is about girls, girlfriends, and sex. I have noticed that he is pretty much always in groups with women on the education projects, and I see him as a pleasant, well-liked, and popular guy, but yet he described himself with tendency to depression, stress, and unwillingness to ordinary things in life. He feels it's all due to a lack of acceptance of his sexual curiosity in his childhood, something similar I experienced among the inmates in the prison. It was also surprising to me that many of the women had problems achieving orgasm, and even more surprising that some of them were able to orgasm when together with a boyfriend, but not alone. Through interviews, I found out that the world is bigger than I experienced in my childhood. In my understanding, you first gain familiarity with your own body and sexuality, and later on, you enjoy it with a partner. But during my interviews with the students, some explained that they felt completely wrong about stimulating themselves, and some had never done it. Some of them even used terms like disgusting. But together with a partner, they were able to have an orgasm if the partner did the stimulation. At the same time, several told me that they wanted to be able to do it. Now we had a knowledge that our culture strongly disapproves children's sexual development and a greater suspicion that it affects the adult sexuality when we disapprove children's play with sexual content. In addition to the knowledge I had gained from the two studies, I also did literature searches. In my literature search, I found different perspectives that all support the idea that children should be met with an open and appreciative approach to their sexual activities. I have written about it in different papers. For English speakers, this textbook may be of interest. You can pre-order it via the publisher. And also this children's book, which have a postscript that briefly describes children's sexual development. You are able to buy it. But here I'll elaborate on a neuropsychological and a cultural psychological perspective. The neurological perspective is about the brain and its development in relation to the developing sexuality. I'll talk about how sexual development is closely linked to the experiences the child encounters and how these experiences integrate with the innate sensory-based sexuality, or you could say experiences. Sensory-based experiences refer to the fact that the child, for example, may feel that it's nice to touch the genitals. It must be linked to the emotions that arise in interaction with the environment. For example, if the child is recognized or if the child is scolded. Now I'll try to explain what happens in the nervous system when the two types of input are connected. Just briefly, the nervous system is experience expectant. The nervous system needs stimulation. For example, a lack of stimulation with light and sounds can have fatal consequences for vision and hearing. With different types of scans, you can see which areas are active. For example, if we are afraid or if we do mathematics. The brain stores experiences through the principle of myelination, or you could also say isolation, of the nerve fibers that are used, which means that electrical impulses can run quickly. Areas that are myelinated are easy to use. For example, if we practice and become good at playing the piano, then it becomes automated actions, and the areas involved are well myelinated. The myelination causes areas that are used to become physically larger than areas that are not used, illustrated here in the form of the fear registration system, which is growing more than other systems in children who are neglected. What is important to know here is that in principle, all experiences can have an impact in relation to how our brain is shaped, and in this case, how we create patterns of arousal. We know that one part of our sexuality that develops during childhood is patterns of arousal. And it matters what type of arousal patterns we develop. Some may be disabling to live with, others may be outright illegal. So it's important for adults to know how we as caregivers can be a source of the formation of arousal patterns. We know that repetitions of experiences in particular shape the nervous system. Recent research says single experiences with marked emotional content also shape the nervous system. Now to the next slide to find out what is happening. It's about repetition of thoughts. It's in principle exactly the same thing that happens when we, for example, learn mathematics or something else that requires mental activity. It is suggested that this typically happens at bedtime. Here you are at rest and can feel the erections that naturally occur of the penis and clitoris between 5 and 40 times during a day, and which can also easily give rise to stimulation of the genitals. The thoughts that fill in such a situation will often be events of a particularly strong emotional nature. Whether it's positive or negative experiences, it seems from a lot of interviews with people who turn on sexually on short hair that this is the mechanism behind our arousal patterns. As said earlier, a lack of stimulation with light and sounds can have fatal consequences for vision and hearing. And we also know that certain stimulation of pattern light and complex sounds have to take place during the first month of life. Here we have a very sensitive period, also called a critical period. Do we have sensitive periods in relation to children's sexual development? I couldn't find research on this very topic, but we know a lot about early emotional development, and we know that physically sexuality of the child must be integrated with an emotional layer, so we need to look at those emotions. In terms of emotional development, children use the impressions they get from their surroundings to navigate the world. The child asks, in a way, if a specific activity is dangerous. For example, if the parents show insecurity during the thunderstorm, the child will also easily experience insecurity during the thunderstorm. Feelings and understandings are passed on from one generation to the next. And it's not only mom and dad, it's also the educators, the doctors, the nurses, the media, you name it, everybody who have a relationship with the child. Some theorists call the attitudes that we pass on for dispositions. They influence our reaction tendencies and applies also to what we experience with sexual content. At least in some cases, we give our children deep-rooted feelings that we pass on to them, largely without noticing it. Some dispositions are helpful, others are destructive. We know that dispositions like children should not touch their genitals are destructive. Some people don't know how to handle it when a child displays joy when touching its genitals. When changing diapers on a baby, the baby will often show pleasure in touching own genitals. A study has shown that when mothers change their baby, most of them look away, or we distract the child, or we rush to give on a diaper if the baby touches its genitals. The picture here is from the children's book that I wrote, Elba's Little ABC for Sex Education. The girl who have turned around and pulled up her dress asks her dad, "Dad, won't you rub my vulva? I think that would be lovely." Using such a picture and the conversation between the girl and her dad, I hope to be able to give the adults who is reading the book for their children a good opportunity to consider their dispositions and how to respond to the child in a welcoming way, and at the same time stick to cultural norms, which, for example, say that adults should not touch children's genitals in that way. At the same time, the child is told, adults are not allowed to rub children's penises and vulvas, and children may not rub adults. Giving children such knowledge is also preventative in relation to sexual abuse. Later on in the book, Elba is in the daycare center where the educator and some children have some conversation about sexuality and how children should act together, what is allowed, and so on. I really hope that the stories from the children's everyday life can inspire the adults to how they can act and support children's sexual development in the many situations that can arise in the company of children. Only a few slides left I want to summarize. Through experiences with sexual content in childhood, the child's physical-based sexuality changes to the adult's sexuality, which is characterized by an emotional layer. This means that the adult can be sexually aroused only by the power of thought, and that childhood experiences have an impact on the sexual development. About 100 years ago, Freud pointed out the connection he believed he could trace between reactions to childhood sexual experiences and the later adult sexuality and mental illnesses. Even then, women were more affected than men, and this is detrimental to the relationships later in life, that should be good and stable in relation to being able to give the next generation a good upbringing. Now I want to ask you, what kind of world do you want? Historically and culturally, we have a situation where almost all of us are characterized by dispositions which says that children should not be sexually active. I think the situation is worrying as we handicap our children, especially our girls, as boys, due to the physique, more easily get to know their genitals. They can easily touch and study their genitals, and in addition, it is also culturally more accepted than if girls study their vulva. I think we should carefully consider what dispositions we want to pass on to our children. Thank you very much for listening. Take care of yourself and our children. They need you and other adults who can guide them, also when it's about play with sexual content. Here you have the notes with references to some of the scientific articles I have used. And at last, but not least, I have an offer for you. You can buy these books at a discount by using the codes mentioned here. You can buy it via the publisher's website. Here you can also pre-order a textbook on children's sexual development. Thank you for listening. It is many years ago that I became aware of the destructive in a non-appreciative approach to children's sexual curiosity. I have tried in vain to change that, and I must admit that I cannot cope with that struggle alone. Therefore, I hope to find people who will help me, and I have a plan if you contact me. Find the contact information on the first slide. Thanks in advance.